Welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I want to talk to you about religion. I want to talk to you about the role of religion in society. I want to do so by analysing the Christian world and the Islamic world. And I want to make the point of distinguishing Islam with Islamism, talking about how these are different and what the different consequences of them are, whether Islam is a uniquely violent religion or not, it isn't, the consequences of Islamism, and the consequences of other fundamentalist or political forms of Abrahamic religion, such as Christianity. And I want to talk about how different societies' conceptions of religion and how different societies' belief in the role of religion in politics has contributed, or at least has correlated, with really different pathways of development. And I want to talk to you about what sociological, what political and philosophical ideas have led some societies, such as the Christian West, to reject Christianity as the basis of politics, and other societies, such as the Islamic world, to not have this same sociological development. So we're going to be starting by talking about Islam versus Islamism and that difference, and then we're going to be broadening the conversation to talk about the roles of these religions and religion in general in a more encompassing way. Now, Islamism is not the same thing as Islam. Islam is a religion. Islamism is a political ideology. Islamism is basically the belief that Islam should guide politics in society rather than just people's personal lives. So Islamism is basically political Islam. Now, when we talk about Islamism, we need to be very sensitive about this because the topic of Islam and Islamism worldwide in geopolitics and both domestically with immigrant populations, it's a very controversial and touchy subject. And it's the kind of subject where huge numbers of people online, and both you might have met in person, are weighing in. And the reality is there's very little actual scientific information on this. So what I want to do in this episode is not just give you opinions, not just give you hot takes, not just give you some random run about what I think Islamism is, which is what 99.9% of people on the internet talking about Islamism are actually doing, but I want to present to you a political science expert consensus on Islamism. I want to tell you what Islamism is and the history of it and the sociology of it from an academic perspective. What, based on actual scientific study, is this ideology? What do we know about it? What are the different forms? How can we analyze this in a political way? So when we talk about Islam or Islamism, the key thing to understand is that this is a massive umbrella term. Islamism, there's lots of different varieties of Islamism. It can be done in lots of different ways. The political Islam is a very vague statement. So the degree to which the tenets found in the Quran are implemented in the society, the way in which they're done so, the means by which this is done varies massively. And the meaning of the word has changed over time as well. So the first use of the word Islamism actually dates to 1697. But Islamism in the modern terms, so Islamism as political Islam, really hit the popular discourse after the Iranian Revolution. So after about 1978 to 79. So some questions that are often asked and that I really want to address here are, is Islam uniquely violent? And why is the Muslim world so underdeveloped? So for example, when we look at the Middle East, the Middle East and North Africa is this geopolitical region stretching from about Morocco to about Iran. And it includes some wealthy Gulf states, but these wealthy Gulf states are wealthy because they've hit massive reserves of oil. Non-petro states, so states whose economies aren't based on oil, tend to be economically underdeveloped as well as being extremely conservative when on sociological studies. So for example, there's this really big study called the World Values Survey, which just goes to different countries and asks them lots of different questions about their socio-cultural views. And this cultural region of both Islamic societies and African societies, so in the Middle East, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, tend to be the most conservative societies whilst also being the most economically underdeveloped societies. Now that correlation does not mean causation. It doesn't mean that one is causing the other. However, that is still a correlation, and that's something that I want to explain to you without giving you some weird bias or rant or political partisanship, but just giving actual academic information. So the first thing to understand is that Islam is an Abrahamic faith. The Abrahamic faiths are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These are all just religions, worldviews, which are monotheistic and believe in a figure called Abraham in the long past. There's no need to get into the theology of this. It's just the fact that these Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are fairly similar to each other compared to other worldwide religions such as Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism or Greek polytheism or whatever, Aztec polytheism, Egyptian polytheism, all these kind of things. As well as newer sort of modern religions that have cropped up in the past 200 or few centuries. So all these Abrahamic faiths come from huge amounts of time ago. So Judaism comes from millennia ago, Christianity comes from about 30 AD when Jesus died, Islam comes from around about 600 AD. So these reflect values that come from centuries ago. And it reflects values that crucially came before this, an ideology called liberalism. So what does all that mean? First of all, when I say the word liberalism, do not get that confused with what it means to be a liberal. So that modern slang word of a liberal, that's not the same thing as liberalism at all. So liberalism is this social and political philosophy, and it underpins all of Western political and moral discourse. It's a philosophy which was first articulated in its modern form in the 1700s in this movement in Western Europe called the Enlightenment, and it gradually became accepted, the sort of dominant ideology in the West in the 1800s, and it sort of spread to the rest of the world thereafter. So just to give you an idea of what this thing is, liberalism, the reason why things like slavery and feudalism no longer exist is because of this socio-political philosophy. And liberalism is this belief system that I talk about this a lot in episode 26, I believe, of Polymath. But just in short, liberalism is a sort of statement. It's a philosophy saying what the purpose of society is. Liberalism is a philosophy asking what is good and what should society be aiming for. And liberalism says that what is inherently good, so the purpose of a civilization, is to establish a society of a free and equal association of individuals. So in liberalism, ideas such as freedom, equality, and individualism are inherently good things. Now, different strands and varieties and flavors of liberalism disagree on the extent to which freedom and equality and individualism are needed. So, for example, in the West, for example, feudalism doesn't exist. People have equal civil and political rights. So people are politically equal in the West. They're not economically equal in the West, however. Some people are far wealthier than others. And different individuals, so different strands of thought, we're really reflecting left-right political debates in the West today, basically sort of centered around to what is freedom and what is equality and what extent is needed. But what everyone agrees on is that these are basically good things. Another really important thing with liberalism, this philosophy that comes from the 1700s, is that in liberalism, when we ask ourselves what is right, what should we be doing as a society, what policies are right and just, we base that on human reason. So we're saying to ourselves, so liberalism basically says, if we want to figure out for moral decision making, we need to consult human reason in order to figure out what is right. What we can't do is just appeal to authority or appeal to tradition or appeal to religion. All these liberalism explicitly rejects as sources of moral decision making. So for example, if you want to justify something, if you want to justify some moral policy, such as, I don't know, I mean, it could be really anything, such as teaching the Bible in schools or whatever, you can't base on the principle of, oh, our religion says that this is what we should be doing. Liberalism explicitly says for any policy, we need to think about how this affects other people and use our ability to reason, rather than just appealing to these other concepts. And some other key ideas in liberalism, and again, these are stuff we take completely for granted, but were just not standard at all for the vast majority of human history up until the 1700s. All people have basic rights. Having a right is an inherent thing for human beings. People should consent to be governed. Violence is not an inherently good thing, and to use violence and to use force, you have to justify it. And when we think of a utopia, an ideal society, you think of a society where everyone is happy, right? That's your version. The policies that you believe lead to a utopia are probably very different, but that's the basic premise of what you think of as a utopia. But for the vast majority of human history, a utopia is just a society where people conceived of as everyone being obedient. So utopias before the 1700s, if you ask some aristocrat in the Middle Ages what their utopia would be like, it would be a society in which the vast majority of people were obedient to state authorities and religion. It wasn't conceptualized in terms of happiness and suffering. It was conceptualized in terms of authority and obedience. I talk about this a lot more in episode 26 of Polymath. And if you want a really long explanation of this, you can listen to episode 9 of Polymath. The point is that all these Abrahamic faiths come before that. So it's not just that they represent old and outdated values. The values in Abrahamic faiths are wildly, almost incompatibly different to the values underpinning Western society today, because they reflect values that come before this philosophy of liberalism. They become before the 1700s, when this philosophy was first articulated in its modern form for the first time. So what this means that when you look at all these Abrahamic faiths from a modern perspective, there's a lot of stuff which really doesn't look good. So you read the Bible or you read the Quran, and there's huge references to slavery and upholding slavery and telling people what they can and can't do with slaves. There's lots of violence, there's lots of bloodshed, lots of wars, God-sanctioned genocides, in fact. So in the Bible, actual genocide, so when both men, women, and children are wiped out of certain people, such as the Hittites, the Midianites, the Canaanites, there's many others, are repeatedly commanded by God. It's a belief system where certain individuals, for example, women, are seen as inherently inferior to other individuals, for example, men. So these Abrahamic holy texts repeatedly advocate female submission to men, and that women should be subordinate to men, they should listen to male authority, and that they shouldn't contradict or defy men. And essentially, it's just a very, very different belief system. There's lots of violence, there's lots of wanton use of authority by exalted figures. For example, King David kills about 10,000 people one time for no real reason. He also has several men killed in order to sleep with their wives. And again, that is presented as a bad thing, in fairness. God is not a fan of King David killing people to sleep with their wives. But the point is that the values, and also a really important point is that suffering and happiness are seen as justified in the name of God. So God and religion is what is the basis for moral decision making, for example, not reason. So when the Bible does not say that you should be getting your moral and political truths from what you deem to be right. It says you should be getting your moral and political truths from that holy book, from what God says. And the Abrahamic faiths have all that in common. So that includes the Quran. It's actually worth noting that for its time, Islam was actually quite progressive for women, and the Quran is much better in terms of women's rights than the Bible is, for example. So the Quran, for example, in Islam, women are allowed to initiate divorces. So if women are in abusive relationships, they are allowed to leave them. Whereas in Christianity, divorce is strictly forbidden, and in Judaism, divorce is allowed, but only if it's initiated by the man. There's also a lot of emphasis on reason and commerce, and there's lots of... It's interesting because the Quran itself is divided into lots of different chapters, and they sort of have different tones and vibes. So some of the surahs of the Quran, or chapters of the Quran, which describe life events from 610 AD to 622 AD, these kind of surahs tend to be much more pacifistic and reason-based and commerce-based than the latest surahs. So the surahs describing the period of time from 622 to 632 is when they talk about power and politics and war, and where they continually advocate for violence and holy war and the use of violence in the name of God. So it's worth noting that Islam, in many respects, was better for women than its time than the Bible, and that all of these holy texts continually advocate violence. And the Quran does not describe genocides, God-sanctioned genocides, in the way that the Bible does. It's worth noticing that the word shibboleth, which you may or may not have heard of, it's a bit of a niche word, it's a bit of a zesty word. So that actually comes from the Bible, and it's because God's chosen people in the Bible were committing genocide, and the way that they determined between people of their own tribe and people of the other side was by getting them to say the word shibboleth, because the languages between the different tribes were different. And if citizens fleeing a battle were unable to pronounce this word shibboleth, they were killed on the site. They were killed on the spot. So all of these holy texts are quite violent. And it's also worth noting that the the exaltation of reason and commerce, because Muhammad himself was a merchant, in the Quran isn't really found in the Bible. And the sort of rise of rationality in the scientific method and commerce are often ascribed as being exclusively Western things, when in reality they're not. However, it's still worth noting that while Islam is a bit more progressive than the Bible is, it still undoubtedly subordinates women to men, it still undoubtedly talks about violence a lot, and it still undoubtedly reflects values which are not compatible with modern post-liberalist ways of thinking that we now accept as normal. The interesting thing is that although the Bible contains lots of atrocities and God-sanctioned genocides, not only do most Christians not know about that at all, but if you ask most Christians about that, they would either outright deny it or they would describe it as awful. So for example, when you go up to fundamentalist Christians in the United States and you quote them verses from the Bible and you tell them they're from the Quran, they agree that they're awful, and then when you tell them they're from the Bible, they just sort of get this state of cognitive dissonance. They just don't really know how to react. And that's really, really interesting, because the point is, for example, if you're a Christian watching this and you're offended by me talking about the Bible and its description of violence, that's good. It's actually a good thing, because that proves a really, really important point. It proves the fact that you're not reading the Bible for its accounts of genocide and war crimes. The fact that people find that wrong, the fact that Jewish people as well, individuals who worship the Bible as a holy book, don't take it literally, and that the accounts of some things that are described in these holy books are now reviled by modern day Christians and Jews, is really, really important, because it means that the actual political and moral values of Christians in the West aren't coming from the Bible. They're coming from somewhere else, and it means that the Bible is being interpreted to fit those norms. Because if you look at the Bible and you look at it talking about genocide and you say, oh, that's wrong, you're disagreeing with the political and moral philosophy of the Bible. And that's really, really significant, because if you're disagreeing with it, it means that you're actually getting your political and moral philosophy elsewhere. And you're using the Bible as a legitimizing agent of that. So that's really, really important. And this is something that happened after the Enlightenment, which is what I talked about, this movement in Western Europe, where people first started advocating liberalism. And a really important part of liberalism is the separation of church and state. And although the Enlightenment in the 1700s was this sort of counterculture movement in Western Europe, it wasn't mainstream in society. Throughout the 1800s, it did become accepted in society, and the principle of separating church and state from separating religion and politics, became widely accepted in the West in the 1800s, and is now standard in the Western world, with the slight exception of the southern United States, where there's still much more overlap between religion and politics. But if you look at I mentioned that World Values Survey earlier. The United States is notably quite a bit less progressive than other Western countries. And I imagine that if you split the United States into North and South, then if you looked at the Southern United States, I imagine that where they stand on how sort of progressive or conservative the ideals of most people in that society are, I imagine that would align more with non-Western societies than Western societies. There's reasons for that. We're not going to get into that in this episode. There's reasons why the North and the South of the USA are so culturally different, but that's not the point. The point is, in the modern West, it's generally accepted that religion and politics should be separate, and that dates to this movement in the 1700s called the Enlightenment. I could make many episodes on the Enlightenment. It's one of the most important things ever to happen to humanity because of this creation of this philosophy of liberalism, but we're not going to get onto that now. The point is that after religion and politics became separate, what that means is if religion and politics are separate, it means that you don't get your politics from religion. You formulate political and societal values based on other things other than that religion. And religion can still play a role in that society, but it means that you then have to interpret that to fit a political narrative. A great example of this is with modern science. Many Christians are scientists, but they'll just not take the 7 days account of creation seriously. They'll say, for example, the 7 days of creation as described in the Bible are a metaphor for evolution. And that's a really great way to keep religion and science compatible. But that's actually a monumental thing, because for the vast majority of Christian history, people did take that literally. And the fact is now, that's being interpreted. The fact that the religious account is being interpreted to fit with a pre-existing set of scientific values is extremely important, because it means that the source of those scientific values isn't religion. That's very, very important. That's a really big thing that happened after the Enlightenment in Western Europe. People no longer took their political and moral values from the Bible. An example of this, by the way, is in the 1900s, women receiving civil rights, and much later, I think really in the first decade of the 21st century throughout the Western world, homosexual marriage being decriminalized. That is a direct contradiction of biblical teachings on the sinfulness of sodomy and the subordination of women to men. And that is a prime example of political values being not derived from the Bible, and instead the Bible being interpreted. So many people there are homosexual Christians, for example, and there are female Christians who don't believe in homophobia or sexism, and they will interpret the teachings of the Bible to fit with that ideology. That's really, really important. So that's the sort of value. That's a really, really important thing. In the Western world, there's a separation between religion and politics, and religion is interpreted to fit pre-existing political values. However, in the Middle East and North Africa, for example, in this region, in the Muslim world, for example, and when I say the Muslim world, I just mean this swathe of countries, which actually extends beyond the Middle East and North Africa. So Indonesia and Pakistan aren't in this geopolitical region of the Middle East and North Africa, but they're still Muslim countries. But in the Muslim world, that decoupling of religion and politics hasn't fully taken place yet. And that's reflected in the fact that in things like the World Values Survey, these are the most conservative countries in the world, because they're adhering in part to a political and moral value system that was elaborated centuries ago before liberalism. So that's really, really important, because if Abrahamic religion continues to be a source of political and moral guidance, that has really big manifestations on the direction of politics and the way that morality is conceived in society, for example. So a great example of this actually is if you poll people in the Middle East. So let me get an example of this, because I've got some statistics. Hold on. I was recently interviewed about women's rights in the Middle East. An interesting thing is that, for example, in Afghanistan, the percentage of women who believe that a husband is justified in beating his wife if she has either burned the food, left the house without telling him, neglected the kids, argued with him, or refused to have sex with him, 80% of women in Afghanistan believe a husband is justified in beating her wife in that situation. In Iraq, that statistic is 51%, and Yemen, that statistic is 49%. I'm going to give more examples of these kind of statistics, but the point is that is reflective of a society in which social and cultural norms still come from an Abrahamic text, which explicitly mandates that women should be subjected to the authority of men, and therefore that the defiance of that authority is an immoral act and deserves punishment. So, unsurprisingly, domestic violence rates in the Arab world are significantly higher than the rest of the world, and 37% of women in the Arab world have been domestically abused. The point is, all of this stuff has really, really important consequences. So basically, an Abrahamic faith, so if you get, for example, an Abrahamic faith plus the effect of the Enlightenment and the liberalism is what we see in the Western world. So the equation for the Western world is Abrahamic faith plus Enlightenment, and we get this modern situation in the West where religion is a sort of source of spiritual guidance and personal fulfillment, but it's not a source of political or moral values. However, the converse situation, as we see in something like the Islamic world, for example, is Abrahamic faith minus Enlightenment. And that gives you religion being involved as a justifier for politics and as something involved in morality. So, for example, in the Middle East, only 25% of countries criminalize domestic violence. So in only a quarter of the countries in the Middle East or North Africa region, from Morocco to Iran, in only a quarter of these countries is domestic abuse or domestic violence even a crime. That is a political policy which is reflective of an Abrahamic belief that women should be subject to the authority of men. So all of this has real manifestations for policy. So Islamism is when you take the Abrahamic faith of Islam minus, so you have the absence of any kind of enlightenment or liberalism, and as a result, that's all the result, Islamism. Now, what's really important to understand is that in the West, Islamophobia often isn't based on this kind of political calculation. Often, many Muslims in the West use Islam as a source of political and social, many Muslims in the West use Islam as a source of spiritual and personal guidance, rather than a source of politics or moral values. So that's completely compatible with Western values in terms of liberalism and the Enlightenment and all the other stuff which we mentioned earlier. However, Islamophobia in the West often isn't just directed towards people who take their political and moral values from an Abrahamic faith. It's generally directed at Muslims in general, which means that Islamophobia generally isn't based on any kind of logic or moral principles. Most of people who have some kind of dislike towards Muslims aren't doing so because they believe necessarily per se because they're annoyed at their values and how women and other minorities are treated. It's simply the sort of basic human instinct of disliking other individuals who are different. It's that basic idea of you have in the West, you have a society predominantly composed of white Christians, and you introduce non-white Muslims, and the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic differences between these groups lead to dislike between them, and discrimination and prejudicial views. Now, when I say that's a basic human tendency, I don't mean that all human beings are Islamophobic, but I do mean that a part of human psychology, and I talk about this a lot more in episode 24 of Polymath, is to categorize human beings as sort of us versus them, as an in-group versus an out-group. And you see this all the time in religion, in politics, in football teams, in nationality, in almost anything. And most of the time in the West, Islamophobia is a reflection of this psychological dynamic, rather than a recognition that when you apply Abrahamic faith to politics, that's not just Islam, it's also Judaism and Christianity. It's a reflection that ultimately those two belief systems are incompatible. So Islamism, for example, is difficult to square with the Western idea of secularism and female and male equality, and the idea of separating religion and politics, and the idea of appealing to reason rather than religious authority when making political and moral decisions, because Islamism as a political form of Islam is a political form of an Abrahamic faith that was formulated before liberalism and therefore is not compatible with modern Western values that have come after Islamism. That have come after liberalism. So the point is that Islamism and liberalism are incompatible. And that's not because of Islam specifically as a religion, that's just the fact that it's an Abrahamic faith. I'm going to talk about later in this episode how it's the same thing with other fundamentalist versions of Abrahamic faith. So fundamentalist Christianity, to give an example, it's the same kind of situation. So Islamism has lots of different forms, and these forms vary a lot, but all of these are essentially different to liberalism. I actually think I might make this a standalone episode on just the nature of Islam and whether Islam is sort of particularly violent or something like that. I think I might make this a standalone episode actually, like one of these 20-minute episodes. But I'm also going to upload a full episode on Islam. So if you're watching this episode, this might be as a standalone episode for a week, or it might be as part of a larger episode. It's sort of similarly to what I did with episode 24 and 25. If you are watching this as a standalone episode, if I do decide to do this as a standalone episode or a standalone clip, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a lovely day. Take care.